And current ASEAN chair, the Philippines, does not see Myanmar returning to full engagement with the bloc for now. And let's find out more about that briefing. CNA senior correspondent Lowy Institute joins us from the ASEAN meeting in Metro Manila. Lowy Institute, what were your key takeaways from Ms. Lazaro's media conference?
Really, two main themes stood out from the media wrap-up conference that Ms. Lazaro gave: maritime issues as well as Myanmar. Now, she started by talking about how the ASEAN top diplomats were concerned about the Strait of Hormuz situation as well as the Middle East situation. She highlighted that the top diplomats had issued a joint statement on the Middle East situation. And closer to home, there was another dispute on the South China Sea. And I won't go into detail because, Angie, you've talked about it earlier in our show. But suffice to say that these two latest recent incidents have now become part of the Code of Conduct negotiations. But Ms. Lazaro did not go into detail. She did say, however, at the start of her press conference that China and ASEAN are now geared towards concluding the Code of Conduct negotiations, hopefully by the end of the year. The other key theme that keeps coming up throughout the last few days was the topic of Myanmar. And Ms. Lazaro had kept honing in on the message that when it comes to dealing with the Myanmar crisis, the main channel is still the 5-point consensus.
Now, Lowy Institute, ASEAN maintains engagement with Myanmar, and that depends on measurable progress. But what does that mean? Has there been progress?
Exactly. This is also one of the key questions that many journalists had asked during the Lazaro press conference. Earlier, I had also met Singapore Foreign Affairs Minister Dr. Vivian Balakrishnan, and I asked him this question. You may remember that Thailand had recently brought up Aung San Suu Kyi as a measurable to see the progress of the Myanmar military, but he was not very specific with it. So I asked Dr. Balakrishnan, number one, how can ASEAN avoid having Aung San Suu Kyi become a political bargaining chip? And number two, how would that Aung San Suu Kyi yardstick look like? Let's take a listen.
What ASEAN has said is if there are going to be changes in our engagement, it has to be predicated on measurable progress that a reasonable person looking at the parameters can say, yes, this is positive. So the examples of these parameters: reduce the violence, hopefully even eliminate violence against civilians and vulnerable groups, the release of political prisoners, though Aung San Suu Kyi is one of those prisoners. But the purpose of the release is not just release for release sake, but in order to enable honest-to-goodness conversations, reconciliation, and a solution that is Myanmar-led and owned by the Myanmar people themselves.
Now, I also want to quickly add on to what Dr. Balakrishnan had said to me, but did not make it out on air earlier. The question of how to avoid having Aung San Suu Kyi as the political bargaining chip. His answer was, first of all, she's not a political bargaining chip to be negotiated on. She is a leader chosen by the Myanmar people whom she still enjoys support from.
Lowy Institute, thank you so much for that report. CNA senior correspondent Lowy Institute there from Metro Manila. And joining us live from Canberra to talk about ASEAN, its influence on Myanmar and regional events, as well as the bloc's engagement with its powerful allies, we have Susannah Patton, who is Nonresident Fellow at the Lowy Institute. Susannah, great to have you with us. Now, Myanmar remains ASEAN's toughest diplomatic challenge. Has the bloc's approach delivered any tangible results, you think? Or does it need to completely rethink its strategy?
It's hard to see much result from the 5-point consensus that ASEAN has used to guide its approach over the last few years. And I think one of the things that we've seen happen since the election in Myanmar is that there's been probably a wider divergence of views among the ASEAN countries about how this process should go forward now. And it's very clear that some members like Thailand are really looking for the opportunity to reintegrate Myanmar fully into the group, whereas it's clear that others, including the Philippines as chair, has made it clear that they're not yet ready for Myanmar to return at that level. And I think you just had some comments from Singapore's foreign minister specifying what some of those preconditions would need to look like from a Singaporean perspective. So the path forward is not very clear for the group.
Now, you've been tracking developments at the meetings. Beyond the joint statements, what were the most important strategic outcomes from today's meetings?
I think the key things with these meetings that observers always look to is not so much necessarily the outcomes of the meeting documents, but also the broader atmospherics and the context for the meeting. And obviously, in this case, the South China Sea is very much front in mind, coming at the same time as this latest confrontation on the water between China and the Philippines. That really makes the Code of Conduct and ASEAN's negotiations with China on that front very much front of mind. It was interesting on that note that we saw quite robust criticism by US Secretary of State Marco Rubio of China, which is something that over the last couple of years the Trump administration probably hasn't been quite as vocal on the South China Sea as the Biden administration. So that's very interesting.
Let's go deeper into the South China Sea situation then. That still remains one of ASEAN's biggest tests. Is there genuine momentum towards a credible code of conduct? Or do you think that the fundamental differences are still too wide?
Well, the idea of concluding the Code of Conduct is very much one of those evergreen headlines that we hear every year about ASEAN, the idea that the Code of Conduct will be concluded. And as I think you're alluding to, the differences and some of the areas of contention are still quite wide, which means that many analysts are skeptical about whether or not that could happen, because it's hard to imagine how China, for example, would agree to a code of conduct which was consistent with international law. But that being said, there was a pretty strong statement from Malaysia's foreign minister. Malaysia is currently the country coordinator for ASEAN-China relations, that he was confident that there would be a code of conduct agreed by the leaders this year. So I think we do have to take it seriously as a prospect, but what that code of conduct would look like, whether there was anything meaningful in there, and what that would mean for the broader commitment of its participating countries to international law, very much remains to be seen.
And if we look at the wider backdrop of the US-China competition intensifying on the global stage, how much room does ASEAN still have then to preserve its own strategic autonomy and centrality?
Well, I think the good news from this foreign ministers' meeting and from other recent ASEAN summits is that ASEAN continues to attract the attention of both the US and China, but also a range of other partners, including, of course, countries like Japan, Korea, Australia. And so, it's striking that even though many questions have been raised about whether the Trump administration is going to be as committed to the Indo-Pacific in the face of many other, competing global demands, including the war on Iran, commitments in the Western Hemisphere. It's really notable that Marco Rubio has turned up at this year's meetings just as he did last year. We've also seen good attendance from Hegseth as Defense Secretary and even President Trump at last year's summit. So all of that suggests to me that ASEAN remains of, reasonably high importance for both the US and China. But of course, a lot hinges on where the future relationship between those two countries goes and whether it's largely defined by competition or cooperation. Rubio's comments were pretty robust about China, but he also indicated that this kind of current frame that the US and China are in terms of stabilization is likely to continue through to another Trump-Xi summit in the United States later this year. So that's something which will heavily engage the interests of ASEAN countries.
Now, looking into that future, what do you think will matter most when it comes to determining whether ASEAN remains indispensable as a regional player in this increasingly polarized world?
I think the main thing really for ASEAN is that its members remain committed to it and that it remains a high priority for those countries. There's been a lot of commentary in the first couple of years of the Prabowo administration in Indonesia, for example, that the Indonesian president is clearly very interested in global cooperation, including with countries like Russia through the BRICS, or working with the US on Middle East policy, and very much a kind of globally focused agenda, versus perhaps being as focused on the immediate region and developing new initiatives to be progressed through ASEAN. So I think the level of interest and the level of ambition of the members, and of course of the chairs, the Philippines this year and Singapore next year, will really be critical to the group's success.
Susannah, what do you see as ASEAN's role in the near future? Many people say that ASEAN's strength lies in dialogue and consensus, but as the world becomes more divided, is that enough to influence events?
I think ASEAN's role in setting norms is really vitally important, because we are in an international environment where support for international rules, even basic principles like the prohibition on the use of force in international relations, is being eroded. ASEAN isn't, a military power. The process of economic integration among its members remains incomplete. But where ASEAN really does have influence is in its normative power. And we were talking before about ASEAN statements. And yes, there's probably not a really large number of people who are out there waiting for each statement to drop. But countries do care what ASEAN says in its statements, especially about sensitive issues, whether it's South China Sea or conflict in the Middle East or Taiwan or any other topic. And I think that's a power that ASEAN has at its disposal when it speaks clearly about the type of region that it wants to be in, then other countries will listen, and that's really ASEAN's superpower.
Susannah, thank you for sharing your insights with us. That was Susannah Patton, who is non-resident fellow at Lowy Institute.